This nugget is the first in a series of 2 related to project scope management. In this nugget, we'll focus on the first 3 areas. Collecting the requirements, understanding what it is the business wants. Once we have a solid understanding of the requirements, we will then define the scope, specifically what the project is going to deliver for the business, and we will continue to evolve the scope through the definition of the WBS, the work breakdown structure, which identifies all of the work required to complete the scope, which will define or satisfy the requirements that the business wants for the project. In our next nugget, we will talk about verifying the scope, the day-to-day activities associated with making sure we're delivering what it is and making sure that we're delivering the project on time. The first step of scope management is defining the requirements. It's all about defining and documenting the business needs, getting a full understanding of what the business wants. A full understanding of what the business wants. Once you have that full understanding of what the business wants, we're well on the way for successful project delivery, because that allows us to define and manage the expectations. We now know and have documented and have agreed upon all of the requirements, all of the expectations, everything that it is that the project is expected to deliver. So collecting and defining the requirements is a very large, very critical upfront requirement. And when I say large, I'm going to say that is relative, as in large. We are in project startup. We're simply at the first step of collecting the requirements for the project. We are in planning stage for our project. So when I say large, it's relative large. We're not doing the project. We are planning the project. But we must define and document those business needs at a sufficient level of detail that we can truly define what it is, the scope for our project. It's a large, and I will again repeat, relatively large, or relative to the overall size of the project, a large requirement, because we must get the requirements right. So how do we go about doing that? So how do you go about collecting requirements? Well, there's many ways of collecting requirements. Here are some of the more common methods suggested by the PMBOK guide. Conduct interviews. You or one of your team members talk to the users. Talk to the business. Document the results of those interviews and ask the right questions in the interviews, and you'll be well on your way to understanding what the business requirements for the project are going to be. Run focus groups, where you bring in key business people and use focus group techniques to understand and to document the business requirements. Workshops, whether they're more informal workshops or whether they're facilitated. Workshops to again work with the business community to understand what the requirements for the project are going to be. Various group techniques. You can use group creative techniques to try to get people thinking out of the box. You can use group decision-making processes to help reach consensus with groups. You may be able to create specific questionnaires or surveys and send them to the business and have the business users complete them to help them document their requirements. Depending on the type of the project, you may be able to go in and do direct observation of the business doing their jobs, and from that observation, define and document the requirements for the project. Often you may want to create a prototype or a model And whether that is a physical model, whether that's a computer model, whether that is a set of actors acting out the requirements, but use some sort of prototyping or model to define the requirements. The key is you need to document the requirements. And as we said moments ago, you need to document the requirements at sufficient level of detail that's going to allow you to plan the project. A requirements traceability matrix. I would suggest, and the PMBOK suggests, a requirements traceability matrix is one of the key tools you have in your project manager's toolkit to help you collect, document, and ongoing manage the requirements. So what is a requirements traceability matrix? It's simply put, it's a table that says here's the requirement, here's how I'm going to solve it, and here's where in detail the project is addressing, satisfying the specific requirement. So a requirement traceability matrix is a very simple table that simply lists the requirements and identifies how the project is going to satisfy those requirements.
The first step in scope definition is developing an effective scope management plan. You need to understand the level of detail that's going to be appropriate for your project. Small, simple projects that may take one person 3 months to complete, will certainly require a far less detailed scope plan than a very large, complex project that's going to take tens to hundreds of people and months to years to complete. So it's very important that you understand the level of detail appropriate for your project and develop your project scope document based on the appropriate level of detail based on the size and complexity of your project. Another significant factor you need to bring into account in scope planning is the general project environment. How successful has your organization been delivering projects in this particular area for this particular business unit using this technology? What is the company's experience? How has the company succeeded or failed? What aspects of scope in previous projects aided in the success of the project or resulted in the failure of projects? You need to understand the project environment. You need to look at the history. You need to learn from mistakes. You need to look at the lessons learned from other projects and factor that in as part of your overall scope plan. The final result is you need to produce a scope management plan. The scope management plan is going to define the process to be used to define the scope and the overall management of the scope. Again, the scope management plan needs to be defined at the appropriate level of detail. Small, simple projects may require a sentence or a paragraph in the overall project plan defining the scope management strategy. Large, complex projects may require a separate document specifically outlining the roles and responsibilities, the processes to be followed, the change management processes to be followed. So again, you need to apply a great degree of control and discipline in producing your scope plan to ensure that you're defining and managing the scope at the appropriate level of detail commensurate with the project's size, the project's importance, and the overall project's complexity.
So with the requirements well defined and the scope management plan, and now more commonly referred to as the requirements management plan, and you're going to get that throughout this series. I'm going to refer to many of the documents based on the original, or not original, but the previous PMBOK definition of scope management plan and the newest definition as per the 4th edition of the PMBOK guide, which is the requirements management plan in place. It's time to start defining the scope. Defining the scope is really taking the results from the collection of the requirements and documenting them to define exactly what it is, what the project is going to do. This is the project. It's going to take all of the requirements that we have gathered, and it's going to identify the requirements that's going to be in our project. Our project will address. And that may cause you to say, well, why would some of the requirements that we got from the business may not be part of our project? It's simply because the nature of the type of those requirements are not appropriate for this particular project. My background is heavily in IT, and there are many business requirements that simply aren't appropriately resolved or addressed through computer technology. So my project would only pick up those business requirements that are appropriate for automation, and other business requirements would have to be handled through either existing manual processes or revised manual processes. But the key to defining the scope is where you identify what is to be included, and everything that's going to be included is part of our project, and it's also going to explicitly state what is not included. And in some instances, it's easy to explicitly state what's not included. It's any of the requirements that aren't going to be addressed by our project. So our project is going to do requirement 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7, and it's not going to do requirements 2 and 4, for example. But there may be other areas, there may be other things that came up in discussing with the business that aren't explicitly on the requirements list that still need to be excluded from the project. So again, taken from some of my IT background, I am going to develop a new application that's going to look after requirements 1, 3, 5, 6, and 7, and is not going to look after business requirements 2 and 4. But it's also not going to be involved with training. It's also not going to be involved with business process engineering. It's also not going to be involved with, Effectively, what we're doing with the defining of the scope is we're defining what is in our scope box and what is not in our scope box.
To provide an example, let's take a scenario where we're going to build a bread box. And yes, I mean a bread box, that metal container, that plastic container that sits on the counter in your kitchen that stores bread to keep it fresh. So to define our bread box, let's set up our matrix, set up 2 columns, and say what is in scope and what is not in scope. So in scope, we're going to define the dimensions. The length, the width, and the height. We're going to define the composition. We're going to define what it's made out of. So we're going to define our bread box with dimensions. We're going to define that our bread box is made out of metal. We're going to define the opening, that it has an opening on the front, that it hinges from the bottom, and so on. So those are the kind of things we need to define in scope to define what is in scope. But we also need to define what is not in scope. Maybe you're a fan of high-tech gadgets and you are aware of a bread box that has automatic controls. There's a little computer chip inside your bread box that measures the humidity level, that measures the temperature, and automatically when the inside controls or the inside environment is not optimal for the storage of bread, is going to turn on fans, is going to turn on dehumidifiers to improve the environment for the bread box. So we're absolutely defining what is not in scope. We're defining automatic control for the bread box is not in scope. We're going to define that a lock on the door of the bread box is not in scope. We're going to define other components that maybe is feasible for a bread box. Again, the high-tech bread box with all the gadgets and all the whistles is going to be concluded, but that's not in our bread box. So we're defining absolutely what is not defined in the bread box as well as what is defined for our bread box. So we're defining the dimensions. It's going to be 8 inches long by 14 inches high by 23 inches deep. It's going to be made out of aluminum. It's going to have an opening on the front that is going to hinge from the bottom. But we're defining what it is not. It is not a high-tech bread box. It does not have automatic control. It does not have locking. It does not have. So again, often you can see that our definition of our bread box, and I think a bread box is a fairly simplistic thing that most people can associate with. We're defining the specific dimensions, and those specific dimensions are consistent with everyone's expectation of what a bread box is, but we're also defining specific criteria that our bread box is not, so that we're not delivering a high-tech bread box. We're not delivering a child-proof bread box. We're not delivering a bread box that's capable of functioning in outer space. We're not delivering a bread box that is capable of being submerged in water. Some people's definitions of bread box will include the automatic controls, the locks, the child-proofing, the out of space, the out of. So by defining the not, we're absolutely managing expectations, because that's what scope definition is all about. It's managing expectations to ensure that we're defining what is included in the scope, the dimensions, the composition, the opening, and we're defining what is not to ensure that people's wild dreams, that we are absolutely managing the expectations. We're making it very clear what is in the scope of our project and what is not in the scope of our project. When we're defining scope, effectively we're creating a box. Everything included in the box is the scope of the project. It's your problem. It's your project. So in the case of our bread box, we define the dimensions, the length, the width, the height. We determine the materials. We determine the opening. Now, I'm not going to list the nots out here, but everything outside the scope, not your problem. Not your project. Now, that goes a long way to defining the scope. Everything inside this box is your problem. It's your project. And you're defining the specifics of what the scope is. Everything outside, as I say, is not your project, not your problem. But in most instances, there's going to be cross boundaries. There's going to be inflows to your project. There's going to be outflows to your project. By defining and managing these inflows and outflows, you are again helping to define your scope. So you're defining that it has to accept this input number 1. And you're going to define specifically what that input number 1 looks like. Now in the case of a bread box, the only input I can think of is the ability to take a loaf of bread and put into the bread box. And it's going to talk about the input or the output number 2. And again, in the case of a bread box, the inputs and outputs would be accepting of a full loaf of bread, and the output would be the ability to take bread out of the bread box for consumption. But if you can take your mind away from our bread box for a few minutes and think of an order management system, for example. So inbound would be the ability to receive inventory items from our suppliers. Outbound items would be the ability to ship product to our companies. Another outbound item would be the ability to ship invoices to our customers. Another outbound item will be the ability to create returns or warranty support for our product. And inbound will be the payments for our project. So as we start to define the inputs and the outputs for our project, we are beginning to define how the project is going to interact in the environment. So it's wonderful to try to create the scope and specifically define what is included in the scope, and that's critical and important. And as we discussed, it's important to define what is not in the scope, what is not your problem, That again helps define the scope of your project, but it's also important to begin to define the interfaces between your project and the corporate environment. What are the inflows? The raw materials, the inventory items. What are the outflows? The orders to the customers, the invoices to the customers, warranty support to customers, payments from customers. So as you start to work on your scope box, as you start to define what your project is and what the project is not, as well as how the project interacts with the environment, you're really starting to do a very clear, very well-defined definition of the scope. The next step in defining your scope is to define the project deliverables. Basically, you need to provide a list of all of the formal project deliverables. A formal project deliverable is an actual end product that the project will be presenting back to the business, back to the sponsor, as indication that a project objective has been achieved and that this deliverable, this end product, has value to the business in terms of achieving the overall project results. Some of the formal deliverables may be interim in-process deliverables. Some of the formal deliverables may be simply a more refined definition of the requirements. But you present that requirements definition, you obtain acceptance, and that allows your project to proceed to the next stage of the project, which is the definition of how those requirements will be satisfied and so on. So producing the list of the formal deliverables, again, defines the scope. It specifically defines what products your project is going to produce, and by examining and reviewing and understanding those end products, the acceptor, the business, will be able to understand, yes, if all of these deliverables are produced, it will achieve my project results. So producing the list of project deliverables is a good step towards defining the scope. But simply defining you're going to produce deliverable number 1, deliverable number 2, deliverable number 3, which is the requirements, which is the design, which is the final product, is a good step, but that probably isn't clear enough. That still leaves room for interpretation, leaves room for ambiguity. So instead of simply providing a list of final deliverables, you need to provide a list of final deliverables with a paragraph, defining the purpose. So if you say, I'm going to produce a requirements document and have a paragraph that says the requirements document will list all of the business requirements, or better still, the requirements document will list the 5 major business requirements that are going to be supported by this application. Again, you're better managing the expectations, you're better ensuring that the requirements document that addresses 5, remember we stated the number, 5 business requirements, is going to support the final goal for the business. The next step in definition for requirements or formal deliverables is not to just produce a paragraph defining the purpose, is going to produce a full table of contents that says the requirements document is going to contain section number 1, executive summary, section number 2, evaluation of current situation, section number 3, evaluation of alternatives, section number 4, selection of preferred solution. So by providing a table of contents for your formal deliverable, you're again better refining what that end product, what that deliverable is going to look like, allow the business to better ascertain, is this achieving my purpose? If I get a requirements definition document that has these sections, is it what I want? The next step would be to take your table of contents and provide a suggested number of pages. So for each section in the table of contents, the executive summary is going to be 2 pages long. The current situation analysis is going to be 10 to 15 pages long. So again, you're now defining the level of detail that will be in each section of your table of contents. So again, you're better managing expectations. If in section 2, the evaluation of the current situation, you're telling the business it's going to be 10 to 15 pages long, That, in my mind, says it's a fairly high-level review of the current situation. If you can summarize the current situation of a business in 10 to 15 pages, you are certainly doing a summary, where if the business was expecting a detailed evaluation of each and every function and each and every process in the current situation, their expectation would be that section of the deliverable would be 75 to 90 pages long. So again, you're doing a good job of defining the expectations. You're doing a good job of managing the expectations to ensure that there's no ambiguity. The final step would be to, again, provide a paragraph that says, in the executive summary, we will do, and it will be 2 pages long. In the current situation assessment, we will do, and it will be 10 to 15 pages long. So again, you need to define the deliverables. The deliverables define what the final product the business will be accepting. The list of the deliverables will allow the business to understand what is being delivered and whether that will allow them to achieve their objectives. Taking the list of deliverables and providing a paragraph defining the purpose is going to allow them to better level set, manage their expectations as to whether this is truly going to satisfy their requirements. Providing a table of contents provides more detail. Providing a table of contents with the number of pages is going to, again, further refine expectations. And finally, providing the table of contents with the number of pages and the description of what's going to be in it is going to do, I believe, an excellent job of managing expectations. So why did I present this as options? Why did I say you could just do a list of deliverables, or you could do a list of deliverables with descriptions, or with table of contents, or with number of pages, or with complete descriptions? It goes back to our original scope plan. What is the level of detail we need to go into for the scope definition for our project? A small one person, 3-month project? I don't believe you're going to do a deliverable definition down to the table of contents with estimated number of pages with a narrative for each section in the table of contents. That's too much detail for a small, simple project. But for a very large project that involves hundreds of people and years' worth of effort, defining the deliverables at this level of detail is absolutely essential to ensuring that you are able to understand, able to manage, and able to deliver to the business's expectations. So again, level set, define the deliverables at the appropriate level of detail based on the size and complexity of your project. But by all means, define the deliverables. It's part of the scope definition. It's the part of the scope definition that makes the most sense to the business sponsor, because then the business can say, yes, if I get these 3, 5, 8 deliverables, and if these deliverables have what I expect in them, and you're managing the expectations at the level of detail here, then yes, this project will achieve my stated goals. I will get the benefit from this project that I expect to receive. The next step in the process is to define the acceptance criteria. How are each of the deliverables, how are each of the end products for your project going to be accepted? Only by clearly defining the acceptance criteria, i.e. only by defining the yardstick, the measurement factors that will be applied against the deliverables, the final products, will you truly be able to define the scope of what those end products should look like. Part of the acceptance criteria is the definition of who. Who in the project team, who in the business organization has responsibility for accepting each deliverable, each final product. Ideally, the project sponsor, the project acceptor, would be the acceptor for each of the deliverables, but often the project sponsor doesn't have the subject matter expertise, and in some instances simply may not have the time to devote to accepting each and every single project deliverable. It's key that you understand who is going to accept which documents. So which deliverables are going to be accepted by which individuals from the business community. By working with that individual, you can then ascertain what their acceptance criteria is going to be. Again, understand the yardstick, understand the measurement that they're going to use to define acceptance. And that defines how. How will they accept? How do they measure? if they receive a document, how will they measure that the document has satisfied the objectives? Will they measure it against the table of contents? Will they measure it against the number of business processes? Will they measure it against the style and presentation of the document? How are they going to measure acceptance? And finally, what is the acceptance process? You may think we've already defined the acceptance process by defining who and what, but there's more to the acceptance process than that. What is deemed acceptable? What is okay? Now, what does that mean? Is it okay if the final deliverable, if the final product has errors in it? And you may think instantly, no, you could never accept a deliverable, a final product that has errors in it. But think about something like buying a home. You go in to buy a new home in a new subdivision, you do your final walkthrough, and as part of your final walkthrough, i.e. your final acceptance, you have your measurement criteria, and in that measurement criteria you walk through your home and you determine that there's a piece of finish missing in the closet in bedroom number 2. As you walk through the home, you notice there's a paint chip on the door jamb in the living room. As you walk through the final inspection, you notice that there's a tile cracked in the kitchen. In my experience of buying a home, those 3 flaws are not enough to say, no, I won't accept this home. No, you must rebuild, you must tear the home down and rebuild it from scratch. Those 3 flaws, a missing piece of finish, a chip on a piece of paint, a cracked tile, are not enough to say, I will not accept the home. They're simply saying, the home is okay, but I will accept it with these 3 flaws, but they must be fixed in 10 days. So it's entirely possible in a business scenario to deliver a final product to the business that has flaws. So again, you're defining what is the acceptance criteria, what is deemed acceptable. Are 3 minor flaws acceptable? What if you walked through the home and found 10 minor flaws? Is that acceptable? What if you walked through the home and found 25 minor flaws? You're probably getting to the point where with 25 minor flaws in a brand new home, you're going to say, no, this isn't acceptable. You're not getting my final payment until all of these flaws are corrected. You're not getting any money from me. You're getting no acceptance. If there are 250 minor flaws, absolutely that final product is not acceptable. So you're defining what is acceptable, how many flaws, and you're defining what is a flaw. If it's a paint chip, if it's a missing piece of finish in a closet, if it is a cracked tile, that's a flaw. If the outside door was missing, that's probably not a flaw. A missing outside door is a serious critical fault and absolutely unacceptable. If an inside door is missing, is that a critical fault or is that a serious fault? So it may well be that you can accept the final home with 3 flaws and 1 critical fault, i.e. a missing door, but no serious faults. So that's what defining the acceptance criteria is all about. Understanding who will do the acceptance, understanding how, what their measurement criteria is going to be, how are they going to measure acceptability, and understanding what constitutes that acceptability. What is okay? How many minor flaws are acceptable? How many serious flaws are acceptable? Are critical flaws acceptable? And I hazard a guess that critical flaws would never be acceptable, but you need to define the acceptance criteria, and then you need to define the scope of your project to ensure that you're able to satisfy that acceptance criteria. Now I'm not suggesting that you deliberately build into your project plan a strategy to introduce 5 flaws into the final acceptance, but you need to know as part of your testing, as part of your preparation for final inspection, how thorough, how diligent, how much internal inspection do you need to apply to ensure that the final product is within the bounds defined by acceptance criteria as opposed to deliberately building in flaws. So with the acceptance criteria in place, with the deliverables clearly defined, with the scope box clearly defined, we are in the position to produce our scope document. The scope document, the scope statement, is probably the single most critical document you're going to be producing as part of project management. The scope document, the scope statement, defines how the rest of the project will be constructed, defines how the project will be delivered, and defines how the project will be concluded, what the final acceptance criteria is going to be. So the scope statement needs to identify the objectives for the project, why the business initiated the project in the beginning. It needs to define the specific requirements that the business has for the project. It needs to define the boundaries, i.e., what is in scope and what is not in scope, with sufficient definition to make it clear and unambiguous. You need to define the deliverables. The deliverables need to be defined at the appropriate level of detail. Is it simply a list of deliverables for a very small, simple project? Or is it a fully defined list of deliverables with tables of contents, an estimated number of pages, and narrative descriptions for each element in the table of contents for very large, complex projects? But with a combination of the boundaries and what's in scope and not in scope, you can fully define what it is the project needs to deliver. And then with the acceptance criteria in mind, what is the yardstick, what is the measurement that's going to be applied for project success, and any assumptions and constraints that are necessary to bound, to define, to put the scope statement in relative position in the organization, you have completed the definition of the project scope statement, and you are now prepared to move ahead with the definition of the project once that scope statement is signed off and approved by the business and signed off and approved by senior management. Once the scope statement has been reviewed and signed off by the project sponsor and acceptor, signed off and reviewed by senior management, our final step in scope definition is to create our work breakdown structure. Define the specific work required to achieve the results defined in the scope statement. Our work breakdown structure should be deliverable based. It should be based on the specific deliverables identified in the scope statement, so we need to define the unit of work required to complete each deliverable. We do this by the decomposition to the specific work required to produce the deliverables. If we take the example of the requirements definition document. So in our scope statement, we defined we're going to produce a requirements definition document. In the table of contents, we defined there was going to be a current situation assessment and that's as far as we took it in the scope definition. Here, in creating a work breakdown structure, we identify the specific units of work required to produce the current situation assessment. So the first thing we need to do is to review the system. Then we need to interview the users. Then we need to understand the current faults. The faults. Then we need to understand the needs. Then we need to. So we're looking at the deliverable, we're understanding each and every deliverable, and we're decomposing each deliverable to the specific work required. So we need to review the system. We need to interview the users. We need to understand the faults. We need to understand the needs. And we have 3, 4, 5 more tasks that are necessary to allow us to produce this section of the table of contents, which will ultimately produce the requirements definition. In order to produce a full, complete work breakdown structure for our project, it's critical that you use a template. If you simply take a deliverable definition and try to sit down with a blank piece of paper and say, what do I need to do to produce a current situation document, you will come up with a number of items. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You will probably get 75 to 80% of all of the items required to produce a good current situation assessment. But you will miss some. You'll miss the 20%, simply because you can't think of everything at a time. That's where using a template becomes key. The template is not a single person trying to think of everything required at a single point in time. A template has been built over years of practical experience delivering current situation assessments. Your organization may have a wealth of templates that you can use. If your organization doesn't have any specific templates that you can use to create your work breakdown structure, find templates on the web. Find templates in organizational trade magazines. But go out and do a search and find good, practical, useful templates that allow you to build a good, solid, robust work breakdown structure. And actually a good source of templates is the source of all project management knowledge. What we're talking from is PMI. The PMI organization itself provides documentation on sample work breakdown structures across a wide range of industries and a wide range of applications that will allow you to ensure that the work breakdown structure that you're creating that's going to be deliverable based will provide a complete scope definition for each and every piece of work that's required to complete your project. With the work breakdown structure completed, you will present that to senior management, you will present that to your project sponsor, and you will say, based on this work breakdown structure, if I complete all of the work defined in this breakdown structure, will this A, satisfy the statement of requirements, the scope statement that has been produced, and more importantly, if this work is produced, is this your expectation of the work that I need to undertake as part of the project to achieve the business objectives for which this project was initiated? In other words, if my project successfully delivers the work defined in this work breakdown structure, will it address your business requirements?
This concludes our first of 2 nuggets on project scope management. This first nugget was focused on scope definition. In this nugget, we talked about collecting the requirements, meeting with the business, conducting interviews, running focus groups, running workshops, using group decision processes to fully document all of the business requirements for the project. We then take that list of all of the business requirements and we define which specific requirements our project is going to undertake, realizing that there may be some business requirements that are not appropriate for our project. We define the scope in terms of what is to be included in the scope of our project and what is not to be included in the scope of our project. And often the most clear definition we're going to get is by defining very succinctly what is not going to be included in the scope of our project. We'll often do a better job of defining the true scope for our project. And then finally, we created the WBS, which identifies all of the work packages that are going to enable us to address the scope, which will satisfy the business requirements of the business unit that we're developing our project for. Our next nugget, we'll look at verifying the scope and controlling the scope, the day-to-day management activities necessary to keep the project on scope during delivery.
This concludes our nugget on scope definition. I hope this video has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.